Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thanks for the invitations from the Prospect Foundation. Thanks our chairman, Dr. Chen, and our CEO, Dr. Lai. And I raised a couple points assessing U.S. high-level or senior officials' visits to Asia and Europe. And first of all, I would like to say the visit demonstrates the Biden administration's promise to revitalize American relations with its allies and partners. I think the travels of Secretary Blinken and the Secretary Austin after the President Biden's inaugurations just echo and confirm what the new administration said about its foreign policy, both during the campaign and after it took the power. President Biden and the Secretary Blinken already repeatedly emphasized that the United States cannot achieve its foreign policy alone. In contrast, Washington has to revitalize American relationships with its allies and partners and choose to return to key international institutions in fulfilling American is back, the slogan during the campaign. Compared to Biden, Trump in the past 4 years did not choose to cut off all American relations or ties with its allies and partners. Still work together with them on some issues. For example, in response to Chinese military expansions in the South China Sea, Washington continued conducting military actions with its allies, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines, and also with its Southern Asian partners like Vietnam and Singapore. But Trump's American unilateralism and the continuing request of military burden sharing are really tough for Washington's allies and partners in Asia and Europe. The Trump doctrine does generate a negative impact on America's global leadership and its relationships with its allies and partners. Therefore, U.S. senior diplomatic and military officials' visits to Asia and Europe just reflect the Biden administration's promise to revitalize American relationships with its allies and partners. Two, the Biden administration places diplomacy prior to military actions in its foreign policy. The Biden administration's senior officials' visits to Asia and Europe also demonstrate that the United States is conducting a strategy of placing diplomacy prior to military actions in its foreign policy arena. Approaches other than the military will be employed first in confronting authoritarianism. As Secretary Blinken argues, the Biden administration aims to divert away from costly military intervention and the policies aimed at changing the regime of other countries. Past U.S. military interventions have given a bad name to promoting democracy and have lost the trust of American people. This strategy is quite different from the democracy promotion policy that Washington has taken over the past 2 decades, because the new administration does not consider that policy is helpful to its foreign policy today, and not helpful either to democratic alliance. Therefore, I believe that the new administration is taking diplomatic measures first to deal with foreign policy issues, and probably will not take a military approach until last minute. On this matter, it is good to see the new administration's emphasize rebuilding democracy and looking for a strong democratic alliance against authoritarian regimes on the one hand. And it does not promote democracy in the region all over the world by risky and costly military actions on the other hand. However, this does not imply Washington is discarding any military approach to accomplish its security and the national interest. Excuse me. Instead, the United States is still preparing carefully its armed forces and the military capability to deal with any international crisis. For example, Washington continued its military presence of naval vessels transit in the Taiwan Strait in response to Beijing's increasing military pressure on Taiwan. And also, the military presence of the United States is continuing in the South China Sea. So, we also can see after the two plus two meetings, Secretary Austin continued its visits to India, while Secretary Blinken was meeting with Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi in Alaska. And absolutely, India plays a very important role in the quadrilateral security dialogue, Quad, which is developed to counterbalance China's military threat in the region. Similarly, while Secretary Blinken traveled to Europe, Sergei Viktorovich Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, also went to visit in Beijing. So we can see diplomacy with military. Military is also with diplomacy. 3, US allies have different perceptions of China threat and the distinct expectations of US-China relations. And those raise difficulty for Washington to conduct its strategic counterbalancing Beijing's challenges. Although the Biden administration is working hard on revitalizing its ties with allies and partners, those allies and partners have different perceptions of China's threat and the different expectations of the development of US-China relationship. Those raise difficulty and uncertainties for the Biden administration's foreign policy. For example, the case of US-Japan alliance is different from the case of US-South Korea alliance. The US-Japan alliance does aim to work together on a clear and common threat target, that's China. In the US-Japan Security Consultative Committee meeting, both Washington and Tokyo reconfirmed the importance of stability and the peace of the Taiwan Strait, and shared their common concern about China's military threat to the Indo-Pacific region. They also had the consensus to counterattack if China takes military actions in the region. However, in the US-South Korea Foreign and Defense Ministerial meeting, both Washington and Seoul did not look at Beijing as their common threat, although they also emphasized the importance of US-Korea alliance. In fact, with regards to China's threat, the United States does not consider China's power expansion and the military modernization as a serious threat to US leadership, security, and interest both in Asia and in the globe. But Korea is not that case. To Seoul, the real threat and the rival is Pyongyang instead of Beijing. Therefore, implications of the gaps between the United States-Japan alliance and the US-Korea alliance, and also between Washington and Seoul, are that in any case of China's military actions in East Asia, no matter the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, or the South China Sea, Seoul, to me, is most likely to be absent in US-led joint military actions against Beijing. This assessment is not only for Taiwan, but also for the United States, Japan, and other democracies. Another case is Singapore. As Washington's critical political and economic partner, Singapore is another hedging example similar to South Korea. It seems that both South Korea and Singapore are not willing to choose either side of Washington or Beijing. And either the United States or China does not ask or push them to take side. This phenomena per se will sharpen US-led joint military actions against Beijing, or cut down strength of a US-led democratic alliance against authoritarianism. Another example is Europe. Europe is another case of the difficulty as well, because Europe is geographically far away from China on one hand, and China is an economic power to European development on the other hand. In order to counter this difficulty, Washington has to bridge the gap of perceptions of Chinese challenges, not only between the United States and Europe, but also between the United States and the Asian countries. Washington also has to increase its economic weight in these areas too. 4, implications to security in East Asia will be very different from issue to issue. So based on the Biden administration's current diplomatic strategy and some ideas of the alliances and the strategic partnerships, the internationalization level or degree of the regional confrontations might be very different from issue to issues in East Asia. First, the case of East China Sea and the Diaoyutai or Senkaku Islands will be definitely involving the United States and Japan. That's for sure. And perhaps India and Australia will be involved too, because Quad. Second, the case of the Taiwan Strait will be involving the United States, most likely. And Japan, maybe not. India and Australia is hard to predict to me. Third, the case of the South China Sea, I think that would be much more complex. We can have 3 scenarios as follows. 1, if China confronts with Vietnam or the Philippines, it will be involving the United States and the ASEAN nations. Second, if China confronts with the United States, it probably will be involving Japan, India, Australia, some ASEAN nations, and some NATO nations. Third, if China confronts with Taiwan on Ituaba Island, Taiping Island, or Pratas Island, Dongsha, it is hard to predict for other nations, but perhaps the United States will be getting involved in the conflict. So these are my observations from the trips to the United States or senior officials to visit to Asia and Europe this time. Thank you. Thank you very much.